As we've learned this year, there are much better ways to study things than just to read your notes or your textbook over and over again. So, for the brain, which is a particularly hard part of this unit for students to remember, there are some great teachers who've come up with kind of some funny little ways to use your hands as a model of the brain, and some other memory tricks to help you more accurately remember the parts of the brain. So, I'm going to go over those with you to review. It's really handy because here on your hand, you have a pretty perfect model of the brain. So this is just our silly little trick. First, you have here the brain stem. So this is the part that comes up from your spinal cord and enters your skull. The one flaw in this model is that actually the brain stem swells just as it gets to the base of the skull, which obviously our wrist doesn't. But the brain stem is part of the lower brain. This is shared with pretty much all animals. And the functions that live here in the brainstem are ones that require no conscious effort. They're basically the life support functions that take place. Things like being able to breathe or to sleep or to stay balanced, just things that don't require conscious processing. So the first part we have here is the medulla. So you're going to take your fingers right here where we feel our pulse and we say medulla, medulla, medulla. And the medulla is the part of the brain that controls things like heartbeat and breathing. So as we say medulla right here where we feel our pulse, it helps us to remember we're saying it like the sound of a heartbeat and where you'd feel your heartbeat. So medulla is for heartbeat and breathing. We also have an area called the pons, and it actually is just a bridge between the brainstem and the cerebellum, which is going to live on the back of the brain. But the pons, we go pons, like we're yawning because it is involved in sleep functions. Then we have the reticular formation, which is actually not a structure in the brain, but it is a system of nerves that run up through the spinal cord and through the brainstem. And another name for the reticular formation that I suggest you remember is the reticular activating system. That activating is a good way for you to remember what it does because it is involved in arousal and wakefulness. So what we do is we just snap like this. We are snapping to alertness or snapping to awakeness. If you remember from class, this is where we had the studies with cats. If the reticular formation was severed, they go into a coma from which they cannot be awoken. And if the reticular formation is activated, a sound asleep cat will instantly snap to alertness. Okay, so here we have the medulla, the pons, and the reticular formation. Then on the back of the brain, we have the cerebellum, which is also known as the little brain. The cerebellum is involved in things like balance, coordination, fine muscle movements. And the cerebellum, we go, whoa, the cerebellum, so we remember the idea of balance and movement. The last piece before we move on to a little bit higher brain structures is the thalamus, and that's represented right here by these three fingers in the middle. The thalamus sits on top of the brainstem, and this is where we're going to picture a talking hand puppet. I like to think of the kind of old shows like Little House on the Prairie where somebody has to make a phone call by calling into a woman who sits at a switchboard. She brings the call into the switchboard. Then the switchboard sends it out. She plugs it into the right spot to send it to the right person in town that they're trying to talk to. The thalamus works a lot the same way. Sensory information that's coming into the brain from all of your senses except your nose, there's a different route for that, will be coming up the brainstem to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends the information to the higher parts of the brain that process that type of sensory information. So we have Thal here. Thal is our talking puppet. The information comes into Thal, and then Thal talks or sends the information where it should go. So for instance, information coming from the eyes is routed from the thalamus to the back of the brain to the occipital lobe where we process visual information, just as an example. So medulla, 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 the pons, the reticular formation, the cerebellum, and we have the thalamus here. From these lower structures, we move into what's called the limbic system, which also can be called the border system. That's what limbic means. It's the border between this old brain and the new brain, or the cerebral cortex that will sit on top. But the limbic system is primarily involved in things like learning, memory, and emotions. And there are 3 key structures in this area that you need to know. So first of all, we have the hippocampus. And if you recall, your brain is actually 2 kind of symmetrical hemispheres. So there's actually one on each side here. So we represent this with your pinky and your thumb. But what we do is we say we have hippos that are going off to camp to make new memories, because the hippocampus is the structure in our brain that helps to essentially work as the save button for new memories that we are forming. So these that wrap around the back of the thalamus, this is just how it looks in the brain, are the hippocampus going off to camp to make new memories. Then you have the amygdala, which it's a word that means almond. So they're kind of almond-shaped structures. They're at the end of the hippocampus, so kind of the fingertip of your thumb and your pinky. And these are linked to emotions like fear and anger and aggression. So we have our pinky and our thumb that are fighting each other to represent the amygdala and fear. The last limbic structure that we're going to look at is the hypothalamus. Hypo means below. So this is the structure located below the thalamus. So we'll use on our hand these 3 fingernails to represent the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates all hormone-based behaviors, things like whether we're thirsty or we're hungry, when we should eat and when we shouldn't eat, our body temperature, the fight or flight response when we're scared or when our body needs to calm down after being scared. So we use these 3 fingers to remember things like food, fight, or flight. So these F's are represented here with the hypothalamus, right? So these are the limbic structures of the brain. Then on top of this, we use our other hand and we call this the thinking cap. So this is the cerebral cortex, the highest, most evolved part of the brain that is really the part that makes us human. All of these things keep us alive. We can form memories, we can feel emotions, but if we're actually going to make decisions or think or do the impressive things that we can do, we're using this cerebral cortex on top. The cerebral cortex is divided into 4 lobes, and we have a little trick to remember that as well. So we'll start here in the front. Right behind your forehead are the frontal lobes, and we use this sign like thinking because these are the lobes of the brain that are involved in things like decision making and planning for your future and making judgments and inhibiting poor decisions. All of that is located here, so we are thinking. Then here at the top back part of our head, we have the parietal lobe, so we act like we're washing our hair. One of the big things to remember about the parietal lobe is that this is where a lot of your sensation of touch is processed. So if you think about washing your hair and you can feel your fingers touching your head right here, that's the parietal lobe. Then here, located in the very back, we have the occipital lobe. So I like to remember, if you visualize your mom or a teacher saying that she has eyes in the back of her head, this is the lobe that processes visual information. So eyes in the back of the head. Then right here by our ears, we have the temporal lobes, and they are by our ears, so that's easy to remember that this is the lobe that processes auditory information. So we have frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes.